Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a video from a channel called NW Creation. This particular video was recorded at their Apologetics Symposium. This talk is titled Dinosaurs and the Bible, so it's either going to be about Behemoth or about dinosaurs being on the Ark. So let's take a look.
We're going to learn a little bit about dinosaurs tonight. Everyone knows a lot about dinosaurs, but I bet you're going to learn a little bit something new about dinosaurs tonight. And in particular, our goal is to look at this subject from within the biblical worldview.
I'm not sure how it's possible to learn something new about a subject by reading a book that doesn't even mention that particular subject. And no, this is not a criticism that the word dinosaur isn't included in the Bible, which is countered by the fact that the word dinosaur wasn't invented until the 1800s. This is the fact that there is no mention in the Bible of dinosaurs at all, with the only passages that can be interpreted that way being vague enough to keep people arguing for decades to centuries as to whether they are talking about hippos, elephants, or sauropods. But hey, maybe this guy is about to shed some light on the subject that will clear it all up, conclusively ending all debate on the matter.
Science is very axiomatic. Your presuppositions govern your interpretations of your findings.
Science is actually not very axiomatic at all. Axiomatic refers to something that is unquestionable or self-evident, an unprovable, untestable assumption. Science relies on as few axioms as possible. For instance, reality is real would be one axiom that science relies on. You can't, as far as I'm aware, demonstrate that reality outside of your own perception actually exists. This is an assumption. Science also relies on the axiom of the uniformity of nature. The laws of physics will behave the same tomorrow as they did today. We can't prove that gravity won't suddenly change how it will work tomorrow, but we have no reason to think that it will, and so far it hasn't. There are a few more axioms that science relies on, but the kicker here is that a Christian worldview relies largely on these same axioms, with some exceptions. For instance, in a worldview that allows for miracles, the axiom is that a god can change how reality operates on a whim, so we cannot necessarily assume that he won't, say, halt the rotation of the Earth tomorrow to allow a favored army of his more daylight hours in which to win a battle, canceling inertia in the process in order to not just have everything fly off the Earth when it suddenly halts. So, really, everyone has some axioms, but the goal would be to rely on as few axioms as possible given their unprovable and untestable nature.
But in order to correctly interpret the world, we really do need the Bible, because that's the only source of information we have that goes all the way back to that very first day.
And this is the sentence that came immediately after you telling us that science is very axiomatic. You assert that the Bible is the one true source of information about the beginning of the universe. That strikes me as rather ironic. You're relying on the unquestionable assumption that your religion is true, and that the book of Genesis is a literal telling of the origin of the universe, right after criticizing science for having unquestionable axioms. Of course, we all know that the real problem that creationists have with science is that the scientific method excludes the supernatural explanations, as they are at best untestable, and if we were to ever figure out how to test them scientifically, that would bring the supernatural into the realm of the natural by definition, and we can't have that.
But the question as to what happened to the dinosaurs is still somewhat debated, but...
Not really. It was the asteroid. We know it was the asteroid. The debate is whether the volcanic activity had any contribution, and the general consensus now is that it did not. In fact, it has been hypothesized that the volcanic activity of the time actually helped with the recovery of habitats that were devastated by the asteroid impact, and possibly even made the rise of the dominant mammals possible, as the volcanic activity would have initially contributed to the global cooling right after the impact, but long-term would have had a warming effect.
The secular scientific community is generally in agreement that there was probably a major asteroid impact that was responsible.
No, they're not generally in agreement that there was probably an asteroid impact. There was an asteroid impact. We know where the crater is. We have a global layer of iridium from it. We have fossils of organisms that we know were killed on the exact day that the impact happened. You're making it sound a lot more speculative than it actually is.
Asteroid impacts seem to be there explanation for most of the mysteries in the solar system.
Look up how the solar system formed sometime. It began as a big swirling cloud of debris that was all bumping into each other, and a lot of the anomalies that we see in the solar system can be explained as being the result of debris bumping into each other. So yeah, something that would have happened frequently in the early solar system being used to explain things that would be expected to happen as a result of this frequent occurrence is not really a surprising conclusion.
Everything that's unique in the solar system. Oh, it's an asteroid impact. How'd the moon get there? Oh, it's asteroid impact. How?
The moon isn't really unique. I mean, it is in that it's the largest satellite of the rocky planets, but the existence of moons is completely unsurprising. Most planets in our solar system have moons. In fact, most have more than one, with most of the gas giants having dozens of moons each, some of which are a lot bigger than our moon. Now, it is possible that our moon is the youngest large object in the solar system, which is interesting and does raise some questions about how it was formed, but really when push comes to shove, being the youngest large object in the solar system is not really all that special. Something had to be the youngest, because that's how time works. The only reason that could be special is if you could find some theological significance to the moon being the youngest, which I imagine would be pretty difficult, seeing as how the Bible says the sun and moon were created simultaneously. And really, same goes for the other anomalies that I think you're talking about, like the retrograde rotation of Venus. Sure, that could have been caused by an impact event, but it could also have been extreme tidal forces caused by the gravitational interactions between its thick atmosphere and the sun. But yeah, you just want to paint a picture of scientists not thinking creatively. What happened to Venus? A rock hit it. What happened to the dinosaurs? A rock hit them. How'd the moon form? A rock hit it. Never mind the complex computer models, mathematics, astrophysics, and everything that go into figuring these things out. It was a rock that hit it.
Same way with the dinosaurs. Big mystery of the dinosaurs, what happened? It's thought that maybe there was a big asteroid that struck the Earth and caused a major climate shift.
Again, we know that a big asteroid struck the Earth. And there is no doubt that such an impact would have a dramatic effect on the climate. Like, if you have an issue with the asteroid impact model, your best bet would be to attempt to dismantle the case that an asteroid actually hit, rather than criticizing the fact that such an impact would have the ability to mess the climate up.
So it caused some climatic change that the dinosaurs were unable to survive, and they all went extinct. The problem with this is there's a lot of animals alive today that are in the same layers of the fossil record that the dinosaurs are found in that are doing just fine.
How is that a problem? The mass extinction that wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs wiped out 75% of all species on the planet, which means that 25% survived. Some of these organisms don't seem to have changed a whole lot in the time since then, like crocodiles, sharks, and feather stars. But these guys also have a history going back a few 100 million years before then, and also without changing much. But they do change, just not a whole lot. So, some organisms that are long-lived are alive today and coexisted with the dinosaurs, having survived the asteroid. What's the problem?
And many of these were much more environmentally sensitive than the dinosaurs. It is, in fact, at this point argued whether or not the dinosaurs, or many of them, were cold-blooded.
Yeah, there is evidence to suggest that dinosaurs may have been warm-blooded. This does not necessarily make them more suited to surviving in a climate that results from an asteroid impact. One of the first challenges to survival would have been the heat. The impact would have heated the atmosphere to red-hot levels for 2,400 kilometers from the impact site, causing massive forest fires. The burning debris that was scattered across the whole planet would have caused even more forest fires, with an estimated 70% of the world's forests being on fire at that point. The easiest way to survive these fires and intense heat would be to live in underground burrows or to be aquatic. I don't think T-Rex was the burrowing or swimming type of dinosaur, so he probably wouldn't have made it. After the initial heat died off, the smaller animals that could survive off of insects and aquatic plants would have had the easiest time surviving, with the smaller predators like crocodiles having the easiest time surviving off of the small mammals. But there just wasn't enough food to sustain the gigantic sauropods, theropods, and others, even if they had survived the initial blast of heat. That's why the small dinosaurs survived, and became what we know today as birds. Being small was a survival advantage after the impact, warm-blooded or no.
However, being that the dinosaurs are in the fossil record, when interpreting fossils like dinosaurs from within the biblical worldview, The global flood is viewed as the cause of the massive sedimentary layers that we see in the fossil record.
Yes, creationists keep claiming that while failing to account for the several different depositional environments that can be found in these sedimentary layers that would have been impossible in the conditions that a global flood would have produced.
And this flood that's described in the Bible was a global scale event. I emphasize this because you're Christians that accept evolution and accept an old age of the earth universally reject the flood as being a global event.
Yeah, there are Christians who recognize that there is no evidence of any global flood event, and so reinterpret the Bible to match up with what we know of evolution and geology, rather than insisting on a severely skewed view of science in order to force it to fit within an overly simplistic, literalistic framework with the Bible. Those are the Christians that I can actually respect while disagreeing with them. Sure, if you put a minimal amount of thought and effort into it, it does look like it's talking about a worldwide flood. But since we know from geology, paleontology, anthropology, dendrochronology, physics, and more that a literal global flood as described in Genesis is impossible, it makes sense to be the kind of Christian who is willing to accept the facts and decide that there must be something more to Genesis than a superficial interpretation.
And if this is a real and historical event, one thing is certain: the geology of this event has been misinterpreted.
That beginning statement, though, is a pretty big if. And it's not just geology that needs to have been misinterpreted if it were true. Human history, genetics, molecular biology, evolutionary biology, hell, even chemistry are all wrong on many different levels if there was a global flood just 4,000 years ago. Where's the genetic bottleneck? How did life evolve so rapidly from the few thousand species on the Ark to the vast biodiversity that we have today, especially given the general non-acceptance of the theory of evolution by people who believe the flood was literal and global? How did Noah and his animals survive the multiple issues presented by the physics of the flood? How did the chemical interactions that are involved in rock formation manage to be so different from how we understand them today? It's not just geology that needs to be reinterpreted in order to allow for a flood. It is basically all of science.
But it's not that they just, misinterpreted the layers of fossils and rocks. They have rejected that event.
Yes, that event has been rejected, because not only is there no evidence for such an event, there is a plethora of evidence against such an event from several independent fields of science. It was not rejected out of hand. In fact, global flooding was used as an explanation for geologic features for quite some time. But as our understanding of geology expanded, there became less and less room for the global flood. So the conclusion that there was no global flood is not so much a starting assumption as it was a reluctant conclusion.
And there is monumental evidence for this event. Let me just briefly summarize some of the most significant evidence for the global flood. One is the fact that the layers of rocks that fossils are found in are so massive.
Are you talking about thickness or lateral continuity? Because if we're talking about how thick the layers are, there are also really, really thin layers. And lots of the thick layers represent climates that would have been impossible during the global flood, like thick chalk beds. Chalk is formed as small organisms known as coccolithophores die and shed. It requires gentle waters and lots of coccolithophores. For the chalk beds that we have, that would have required more coccolithophores than it would be possible to sustain in the ocean at one time. If you're talking about lateral continuity, that is tracing the layer horizontally, that's actually more evidence against the flood because we can see environments shift as we trace the depositional layers. As we trace the layer laterally, we can see where the environment went from deep marine to shallow marine, and then from shallow marine to beach, then from beach to riverbed, all in one temporal layer. How does that happen if the layers were caused by a global flood?
Hundreds of feet thick. In places, these layers of rocks are kilometers thick. And they extend for hundreds and in some cases thousands of miles.
Okay, so you were talking about thickness and lateral continuity. Gotcha. So how do you explain the presence of beaches, rivers, glaciers, deserts, river deltas, rivers draining into dry basins, and swamps during this global flood? Those are just a few of the many environments that we see represented in all of these layers that you say were laid down by one flood.
The layers that you see in the Grand Canyon shown in this diagram all the way over on the right, the layers of rocks exposed in the Grand Canyon can be traced all the way from Arizona to Utah and beyond.
Yep. because depositional environments are big. When geologists say that limestone formed in the shallow waters of a vast sea, did you think that vast sea meant limited to one area based on state boundaries?
These layers of rocks that are formed in water, sediments or particulates that are transported in fluids and deposited elsewhere, these layers that fossils are found in, these sedimentary rock layers, form in water.
Yeah, water is a key ingredient in the lithification process of sedimentary rocks. Nobody denies this. But here's the thing. Water covers most of the surface of the Earth. It is one of the most abundant substances on the surface of the Earth, and it is basically a universal solvent. That is, almost anything can be dissolved in water, making it an excellent method of transporting sediments. The idea that rocks which had their beginnings on the surface of the Earth, which is about 71% water at the moment, would somehow exclude water from that process unless the surface were somehow 100% covered with water, is laughable. Even more laughable is the idea that all of the different depositional environments, most of which are definitely water-related, could have happened during the flood. Evaporite deposits have to do with water. That's when you have an inland lake or sea whose outflow is slow enough that the water evaporates faster than it flows out of the basin. As the water evaporates, the minerals within the water crystallize and form layers on the floor of the basin, often in repeated cycles. How does that happen in a worldwide flood? I mean, sure, I could see a case being made that evaporite would form in plenty of places after the floodwaters receded and pools left behind by the flood, but that wouldn't happen in the cycles that have been observed and whose origins have been experimentally verified, nor would that result in more sedimentary layers being laid down on top of the evaporite. Just look at the Detroit salt mines. The salt deposits being mined there are buried under 340 meters of other types of rocks. How did the flood do that?
And they blanket the globe. Massive layers of rocks, hundreds of feet thick, that extend for miles.
Good point. They do blanket the globe. Except we can watch the depositional environments change as you trace them laterally. If they were truly formed in one single environment, namely your flood, then even if the flood could somehow account for all the different depositional environments, we would expect each layer to be global, and for every segment of the stratigraphic column to be identical. But as creationists are so fond of pointing out, there is no universal geologic column, with all the rocks being the same types of rocks in the same order. That is something that would be expected if the layers were actually laid down by the flood. But no, as we trace the layers laterally, we see the environments change, as would be expected if they occurred on a planet with many different local environments existing simultaneously. This is where the dreaded index fossils come in handy, because we obviously can't trace every layer laterally indefinitely. Aside from geologic events that make things difficult, we have, cities and oceans and things that would get in the way of such an ambitious excavation. So we use things like volcanic ash layers, which each have a unique chemical composition, or index fossils to match up the layers that are geographically separated. You brought up the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. That left behind a global marker that makes it rather easy to match up the layers around that event, because when an event is large enough to affect the entire planet, it leaves its mark everywhere on the planet. Funny that we can find the mark of an asteroid that you seem to think never hit us, and yet the global flood remains strangely elusive.
We also find ocean fossils everywhere. And I mean everywhere. You can go up to the tops of every mountain chain in the world and find abundant ocean fossils.
Well, I don't know about every mountain chain, but yes, marine fossils on top of mountains are a common occurrence. Now, in a torrential flood, do you know what doesn't happen? The floodwaters do not bring sediment to the tops of the hills for deposition. It drops the sediments down in the low points, because that's just how water and gravity behave. Which means that a global flood, if it had somehow been gentle enough to allow the organisms to get up to the mountaintops before they died, and there is plenty of evidence to suggest that they were happily going about business as usual in the environments that they died in, then there is no way that this flood would also have brought sediment uphill working against gravity to bury these organisms. However, since there is enough evidence that even most creationists accept the fact of plate tectonics, this gives us a new explanation. What are mountaintops now used to be seafloors a long time ago. We know that tectonic activity lifts the mountains. It is still happening today. Mount Everest is growing as we speak at a rate of about 5 centimeters per year. This is the result of the Indian tectonic plate being subducted beneath the Asian tectonic plate. An observable process that we can see happening today. That's the kind of science that creationists like best, isn't it? So either this observable process that we can see happening now continued at about the same rate that is happening today for a very long time into the past, or a flood behaved in a way that breaks the laws of physics. Those are two potential explanations. Which one seems more likely?
Andes and the Alps. But the fact that ocean fossils are found on the tops of mountains isn't really the big deal, because mountains can build. And fossils that were originally laid down in a floodplain can get shoved up through tectonic activities and become the top of a mountain.
Hey, stop debunking yourself. That's my job.
But it's not the fact that they're on the tops of mountains, it's the fact that ocean fossils are found in every single layer of the fossil record.
Why is that surprising? Oceans have existed during every single time period in which life has also existed. Never in the biological history of our planet has the entire surface been dry. It would be much more surprising if you could find a geologic time period that had no evidence of ocean-dwelling organisms. Seriously, how can you look at our planet, which is mostly covered in water, and then claim that our finding of organisms that lived in water proves that there was a time with no land?
We also see fossils that show extreme preservation.
Yes, in extremely rare cases, we find fossils which are very well preserved, to the point where sometimes we've been able to identify stomach contents. Do you know what is more common than extreme preservation, though? Evidence that the organism, whatever it was, lay exposed for a bit after it died but before it was buried, like teeth marks from scavengers. Sometimes we find the teeth of the scavenger nearby, or even embedded in the bone it was picking on. If everything were buried in Noah's flood, we would expect most fossils to show signs of extreme preservation. The fact that extreme preservation is the exception rather than the norm is more evidence against the flood. Now his next claim is the dinosaur soft tissue claim, which is a claim that has been so thoroughly dealt with that I created a playlist of my favorite videos about it, as well as some of my own. So if that interests you, here's a link so you can watch it through. He doesn't bring up anything that isn't dealt with in those videos, so I'm skipping that bit.
In 2005, they found a dinosaur was found in the stomach of a mammal.
Yep, it sure was. Not sure how that's supposed to be a problem. I mean, sure, that mammal was bigger than mammals of the time were thought to have grown, but that just means we need to adjust our picture of the Cretaceous ecosystem. I'm not sure how this is supposed to be a problem for evolution. Creationists love to do this. They'll bring up a new discovery that caused us to rethink something, and then claim that because it caused a rethink, we must be forcing the evolutionary worldview on it. Like, no, there's nothing in evolution that says large mammals couldn't have been around then. We just don't assume that they were before we find evidence of them.
You cannot convince them. Their interpretation is incorrect unless you literally find one animal in the one animal in the stomach of another.
No, had the stomach contents not been found, we would still have adjusted our picture of the Cretaceous period to include the new animal that was discovered. Like I said, there is nothing in evolution that would exclude large mammals from having coexisted with the dinosaurs if they could have found some niche that would allow them to coexist. We just don't have evidence of anything larger than the one we're talking about, which was about a meter long. However, with the flood model, all animals should have been coexisting together, so find me that Precambrian bunny, then we can talk. Forget the Precambrian. If you can find me conclusive evidence of any mammal existing that a non-creationist paleontologist would date to 300 million years or older, I'll give you every last penny that is made from this video, including the Patreon money. It won't make you rich or anything, but it's enough that I wouldn't make this promise if I wasn't absolutely certain that mammals did not exist 300 million years ago. You see, with these kinds of things, there is some wiggle room. The first mammal that we are aware of showed up just after 180 million years ago. But that doesn't mean that there couldn't have been some older mammal that was here 190 million years ago that we just haven't found yet. It's not likely, but it's possible. It would be an amazing discovery, but it would not do anything to disprove evolution. But 300 million years ago, the ancestors of what would eventually become mammals were still very reptilian, the non-mammalian synapsids, or mammal-like reptiles like Dimetrodon. So no, modern mammals did not exist back then.
A display at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks contains this hadrosaur toe bone that is not fossilized and allowing visitors to touch real dinosaur bone.
Sort of. And as usual with creationists, you're not telling the full story. You see, a fossil is technically just any evidence of an organism that is preserved in rock. There are many different types of fossils, and yes, the most common type of fossil for animal bones is a permineralized fossil, in which dissolved minerals in the groundwater gradually replace the organic material of the bone, leaving behind a mineral cast of the bone rather than the bone itself. However, in rare cases, actual bone can be preserved, with it being more rare the farther back in time you go. Now, if all of the fossils we see today were formed a mere 4,000 years ago, you would expect that this would be the norm rather than the exception. So, once again, your example proves my point instead of yours.
The caption, I don't know if you can read the caption there, it says, "This is real dinosaur bone from a hind foot of a genus of hadrosaur."
Coward. I see that big word there. It's a grunaluk. Yes, I probably mispronounced it horribly, but at least I had the courage to try.
Although it is 69 million years old, it is still original bone and not rock. I'll tell you, how do you get original, still have bone after 69 million years? Requires some extraordinary conditions, to tell you what.
That's a clean burning hell, I tell you what.
Yep, it probably did have some extraordinary conditions in its preservation. But if the permineralization process can happen fast enough for most 4,000-year-old bones to be permineralized, then it would require extraordinary conditions for it to fit into your model as well. In the evolutionary model, there's nothing that says that water has to infiltrate every fossil and remove all the organic material by a certain time. Some variability is to be expected. So either both of our models would expect a non-permineralized fossil to be the exception rather than the norm, in which case it really wouldn't be good evidence against either, or the flood model predicts that most fossils would be non-permineralized, in which case the flood model is obviously wrong. In the first case, it is pointless for you to bring it up, as it wouldn't meaningfully help anyone decide between either model, and in the second case, it works against your position. I'm fine with either.
So if this is true, that the dinosaur fossils and in general the fossil record is the result of a global flood, well, one thing the Bible does say with certainty, and that's that 2 of every kind of animal that was alive at the time of the flood was put on board Noah's Ark.
In other words, if you take the story at face value, then the implication is that it's even more ridiculous than the cutesy cartoon arc stories that AIG hates so much. Because if you're going to insist on having dinosaurs on the Ark, then you need every other land animal that has gone extinct to be represented on the Ark as well. So for instance, the non-mammalian synapsids. There were a lot of animals that were not dinosaurs that do not exist today that would have had to have been included on the Ark. So a boat that was already overstuffed with animals now has to find room for thousands to millions of new animals, because creationists have to take Genesis at face value rather than trying to think about other potential interpretations.
Well, one of the things that we got to keep in mind is that there weren't a whole lot of different types of dinosaurs.
There are about 700 known species of dinosaur. There were probably a lot more than that, but those are the ones that we have fossils for. Remember earlier when you were criticizing the evolutionary view that we don't pretend animals existed in certain time periods until we actually, find evidence of them having existed there? Well, now here you are pretending that animals didn't exist that most certainly would have. Unless you're going to try and argue that the fossil record is actually a complete record of life on Earth and that we have found everything in it that there is to find, which is a ridiculous argument to make.
And if we're correct about evolution, about how speciation and diversifications of kinds took place, most of your creation biologists regard the family level of classification, at least within the mammals, to probably be synonymous with the biblical kind.
Okay, ignoring all of the other problems with what you just said, and trust me, there were many, that means that you are in agreement that humans are great apes, as humankind is part of the hominidae family, along with chimps, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans. So if you are willing to admit that these 5 species are all the same kind which came from a common ancestor that was the original created kind, then I don't see why you would bother objecting to the rest of the theory of evolution. Unless, of course, you just need to keep shifting those goalposts depending on which organism you're talking about in order to make it look like kind is actually a meaningful distinction.
So, for example, the felines, the family Felidae, that contains all the cats, was a biblical kind.
So then you'd agree that saber-toothed cats were a different biblical kind from any modern cats? Because they were not in the family Felidae. What about the linsangs of Southeast Asia? They aren't in Felidae. How about civets? They aren't in Felidae either. Then we get into what are called the false saber-toothed cats, the Nimravidae. They are neither in Felidae with the modern cats, nor are they in Barborophylidae with the true saber-toothed cats. Then we get to things like hyenas, which are more closely related to cats than they are to dogs, but they look and behave in a very dog-like manner. So, just with this, Noah had to take a representative of the modern cats, civets, linsangs, saber-toothed cats, false saber-toothed cats, hyenas, and more, just to get to the diversity of the Feliformia clade if we leave the kind divider where you have placed it. And we have to go through the same process with all the other families. And I left out a bunch from Felidae, so it's even worse than I'm making it out to be. Suddenly that massive arc is looking a lot smaller. But such is the nature of the creationist catch-22. Either you place kind too far down on the taxonomic ranking system and you end up having to include way too many animals on the arc in order to represent all the different kinds, or you leave it too high up and then not only remove any meaningful distinction between micro and macro evolution, but actually require evolution at scales so large as to leave your objections to evolution rather pointless. And that's where I'll leave it for today. There's still 55 minutes left in his video, so if there's enough interest, I'll cover that next week. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Alexandro Roca, who says, "Interesting, when Bill Nye says something controversial, he's only an engineer, not a scientist." Good point. This was on Monday's video where a real estate guru who was dressed like the living personification of the Vegas Strip was interviewing an engineer named Flanders about all the problems with the theory of evolution. And a common creationist, I don't want to call it an argument, but I have heard it used as such, but common creationist talking point, I guess, is that Bill Nye is just an engineer, not a scientist, as if he were trying to hide that fact. I actually remember, at work once, one of the dishwashers had creationist leanings. When he tried to convince me that evolution is a myth, I started going through all the usual rebuttals to everything he was saying, and eventually he just blurted out, "You know, Bill Nye isn't actually a scientist, right?" As if that were supposed to have rebutted something, to which I replied, "Yeah, he's an engineer. What's your point?" Ah, fond memories. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, especially David Schinkel, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, and What Jesus, as well as William, who donated this week through PayPal, who are all the minerals that replace the bones that are my channel. If you'd like to permineralize me, you can support the channel for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. Other ways to support the channel, such as direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, are linked in the description, as well as my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!